You know that we took a trip. We bought a brand new atlas, and away we went. Only the new atlas, by being they tried to make it bigger, and so you had to divide the states into two different pages, and it turned out that was much less helpful than we realized, and so we wrestled with this atlas all the way across the country, but we made it work. We got there, and we got to Washington. Finally, we got to Florida to visit where our daughter was about to have a child. And they said, well, how in the world did you get here without a GPS? It really bothered them. In fact, it bothered them so much that my daughter said, well, we have a GPS that we never use, so take it and see how much better it's going to be. And so they gave us that GPS. It did help with some things. We found it did not help with finding the highways and getting to the next city and so forth. But once you're in the city, you could type in the name of a motel and it would tell you where it's at, or a restaurant. And so we found that there were uses for it, and we did use it off and on the way home. It turns out that GPS is not such a new thing, that there was GPS 2,000 years ago. As in our passage this morning, as the Magi were trying to determine where this baby was going to be born, they were led by a star. The Bible calls a star. And the Bible says that the star led them to Jerusalem, and then they started looking around trying to find the baby. Where is he, the one that's born the king? And then the star shows up again and puts them takes them right to the very house where the child and the mother are. So, we hear a lot of talk about how cool GPS is. Well, it's not that new.
Yeah.
We've had it. In our passage today, we're going to talk about the mission. A sacred mission, and then a secret mission, and then a successful mission, and then finally a stealthy mission. The sacred mission, I can't say it, the sacred mission involves the Magi, the star, and the king. The Magi. Who were these guys? The Magi, verses 1 through 6. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem, the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, where is the one that's been born the King of the Jews? For we saw his star while we were in the east, and have come to worship him. These Magi, who are these guys? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us where they came from, or how long they'd been traveling, how many there were, or what was their rank, and then where did they go? They kind of slide into the story, silently offer their worship, and then disappear again. Tradition, as men are wont to do, tradition fills in those gaps for us. And so tradition tells us that there were three of them, probably because there were three different gifts. Tradition says that they were kings, and that their names were Casper, Melchior, and Balthasar. I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us that, but and maybe it can be true or maybe not. We don't know. But we do know that the Magi were the scientists of the day. They were astrologers often. They were doctors, alchemists. They made up the medicines and stuff. And they were considered to be wise people that you would consult. They knew a lot about a lot of stuff. And so these fellas, as they were getting together in their annual convention of wise men, one year they came together and all of a sudden they said, well, hey, you notice that new thing shining up there? Yeah, I noticed that. I wonder what that's about. And they got together and they had a meeting about that, and they decided that they needed to follow this star, this new star that had been discovered. And so they formed a committee and they took off for Jerusalem. They probably had to travel at least 5-6 months because they probably came hundreds of miles. And then when they got there, then they still had to find, still had to find the baby. But these guys are special men. God used them to point a big giant sign at the baby Jesus that said Messiah. Big flashing sign right here. This is the Messiah. These are Gentiles, for Pete's sake. They weren't even Jewish people. They were just aware that the Jews had these prophecies, and somehow they moved towards Judea, and as they were led by the star. Well, what about the star? A lot of writing about the star. Men have tried to figure out, well, what was this special star? Was it a star, a real star? We know that it probably would not be, because a star doesn't move around that much. And if it came close enough to point to one house, that might be a little dangerous for us and the whole earth, because they're too hot. Some have said it was a comet. Halley's Comet went through there about that time. Maybe it was a comet that God used to lead these men. Or maybe it was certain planets, Jupiter and another one, coming close together, and they form a real bright light in the sky when they do that. It's called a conjunction. Lots of suggestions. You know, God could use meteors or whatever he wanted. I think as I studied that, I think one of the finest suggestions and really one of the most enlightening ones for me is that of John MacArthur. John suggests that if you think back to the Old Testament, God traveled with his people. And how did he travel with those people? He was in the form of a cloud during the day and a bright star, a bright fire at night. And that consisted of the Shekinah glory of God, the presence of God. And it just seems right that maybe he's on to the right track here, that it would be God's glory. Because here we have the birth of Christ into the world, into humanity. And why wouldn't that be noted with a special emphasis of God's glory? And how perfect, how appropriate that God would lead those men again using his glory, the brightness of his being. And then they come from the east. They get to Jerusalem and they start asking around, you know, where's this baby that's born the king? And Herod hears about it, and he calls them in and says, "Who is this you're looking for?" Well, we're looking for the king of the Jews that's being born here. And so he says, well, go and find this king, and I want to come and worship him too. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But when they go back outside, guess what? The star is there again. And it says they rejoiced, they were exceedingly glad when they saw the star again, because the star led them right to the house. So the star, I think it was God's glory evidenced in the form of a very, very bright light. That's just, I think I'm going to go that direction. Doesn't really matter what we think, because whatever it was, it worked. And then what about the king? The king. One man has titled this his sermon on this, King of the Jews, hunted by the King of the Jews. Turns out that people are not, no one has ever born a king. I've never thought of that before. You're born a prince, and then you grow up and you accede to the throne of the king. In this case, Jesus was born, he was the king right away.
Amen.
He was born the king. And the words of the Magi bear that out. The saddest thing about this whole story about this king, everybody knew. Everybody knew where he was supposed to be born. In fact, there are several historical writings that kind of point to this. There was a sort of a feeling in the air, so to speak. And several other historians, secular historians, were talking about what a strange time it was. But everybody knew when Herod called in his wise men and the Jewish leaders, he said, where's this king that these guys are talking about? Oh, he said, in Bethlehem. He's born in Bethlehem. They knew. They should have been waiting for him. They should have been looking for him. But who's looking for him? The guys that travel 500 miles. The Gentile people that traveled for 500 miles to come and find him and worship him. And the Jews closed their eyes and said, no, can't be. We're looking for a warrior king. We want to be delivered from the Romans. And they knew the truth, but they blinded themselves. They closed their eyes to it. The sacred mission of the Magi was to point out to Christ and to bring him worship. The secret mission is next in verses 7 and 8. Herod secretly called the Magi and ascertained from them the time of the star that the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and make a careful search for the child. When you have found him, report to me that I may come and worship him. All right, so first we have deception. He pretends he wants to come and worship him. And secondly, we have danger. When you're dealing with Herod, you have danger. Herod was not a Jew. He was only half Jew. He was actually an Idumean, which is a son of Edom. And that would make him a son of Esau, to get it all the way back to the beginning. And so he wasn't a true Jew, but somehow he ingratiated himself with the Romans, and in 47 BC, they made him governor over that area. And by his power, political power, he was able to control it. And that made the Romans happy. Keep them Jews under control. And so in 40, a few years later, they actually gave him the title of king over his area, King of the Jews. And he loved that. And he was not a bad king in many ways. early on especially. He was generous. He kept the peace. He rebuilt a new temple in Jerusalem. People like that. When times got tough, he would cut back the taxes on the people. They appreciated that. And then they actually called him Herod the Great. And he didn't totally not deserve that title. However, as he grew older, his suspicious nature took over. And he became more paranoid. He became more suspicious of those around him. And we're told that it wasn't long before he began to eliminate people whom he felt were a threat to him. William Barclay records it for us. He killed his wife. He murdered his wife Miriam and her mother Alexandra, his eldest son Antipater, and two other sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, were all assassinated by him. The emperor, the Roman emperor Augustus, said this. He said that it was safer to be Herod's pig than to be his son. That's saying a lot. His savage and warped nature can be seen when he reached the end of his life. He became 70 years old, and he knew he would not live for much longer. And he knew that by that time, people feared him and disliked him enough that none would weep for him. Plus, he killed all his relatives. And so his solution to this was to round up almost 100 of the elite in the city that he stopped in. He retired in Jericho, and they had the elite of that city rounded up and put into prison with the orders that when he died, they would all be killed that same day. He said, if nobody will weep for me, tears will still be shed. Well, that's a pretty gross kind of thinking. S. Lewis Johnson talks about him this way. He says, by this time Herod was a murderous old man and insanely jealous. And any kind of rivalry he could not stand. He was a lovely character, being sarcastic here. He had murdered his wife. He had murdered his mother-in-law. Well, perhaps that's not so bad, you might say. But he had murdered one of his sons, and then later on 2 more of his sons. So he was a murderous old man, and he did not mind murdering those who were nearest to him. So when he became disturbed, the whole city became disturbed. This is in reference to the statement here that where it says in verse 3, when Herod the king heard it, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Why would you think the whole city is upset when the king's, just because the king's upset? Well, when Herod became upset, he did irrational things. And so everyone, and that's played out in the slaughter of the innocents coming up. So he had given the Magi a secret mission. He sent them on their mission, and that was a successful mission, verses 9 through 11. Having heard the king, they went their way, and lo, the star which had been seen in the east went on before them, till it came and stood over where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And they came into the house and saw the child with Mary, his mother. They fell down and worshipped him. And opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They were led to the right house by the star. They loved that star. That star was a beautiful thing to them. And it worked really, really well. When they got there, we're told that they fell down on their face and worshiped him. It's important to notice they did not worship the parents. They worshiped the baby. And they gave to him their treasures, their gifts. 3 gifts, 3 different gifts are mentioned. They may have brought more. I don't know. But we have 3 gifts mentioned. The first is gold. A gift fit for a king. Gold. And frankincense, a gift fit for a priest, which Jesus became. The Latin word for priest is pontifex, which means a bridge builder. And that's what Jesus did. He built a bridge between us and our Heavenly Father so that we could approach him. And so he was given frankincense, representing the fact that he's going to be our priest. And then he was given myrrh. Myrrh is a gift for one who is going to die. When Jesus died, they brought spices to wrap his body in. They wrapped his body in the cloth, and then they put the spices over the cloth, and they wrapped more cloth around. And myrrh is one of the spices that they used to embalm the bodies. And so we have here a kind of a hint that Jesus has come, even though he's a baby. The hint is there that he's going to grow and die on behalf of the others. There's a portrait done by a man named Holman Hunt. I believe he painted this back in the last century sometime. It's a portrait of Christ in his youth. He's working in the carpenter shop, and he comes to the door of the shop, and he's stretching. He's got his arms out and is stretching his back. You can sense the aching back from leaning over the carpenter's bench. But as he stretches out his arms, the sunshine comes through the door and forms on the wall a shadow in the form of a cross. And then down below here is a picture. There's a picture of Mary looking back at the shadow. And you can sense that the youth, the Christ the youth, there's a foreshadowing of Christ the man, Christ the sacrifice on the cross. Very beautiful picture. The myrrh represents the fact that the baby will grow to become the lamb that God sacrifices. Successful mission. They came and they worshipped. What did they do when they worshipped? They bowed and they gave. They gave gifts. We're not told that they sang anything. They didn't have a sermon. They came and they gave. And I think there's a lesson for us there. I think all too often we think that when we come to worship, it's all about praising and so on. It's giving. It's giving of ourselves. God doesn't want our gold and our incense and our myrrh. He wants our hearts. He wants ourselves. And when we come in a perfect worship, we come to give ourselves completely to Him. A successful mission. And then verse 12 tells us of a stealthy mission. Having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed for their own country by another way. You ever wonder how long Herod waited for them before he decided they weren't coming back? You know, I'm surprised he didn't put a tail on them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like they could go really fast on their camels or whatever they, walking, whatever. But apparently he did not. And they were warned then by God that they were not to return to Herod, but to go on home. And so they went by another route, not through Jerusalem. We also, in our lives, as God comes into our lives, he gives us a mission. A sacred mission. We are to come and worship the Christ. And then we are to go and spread the gospel. That's our sacred mission. And our prayer is that it will become a successful mission. As we go from here today, we go as men and women charged with the gospel of Christ to share it with all of those around us here in Whiteburg. And wherever we go. Maybe in California. Never know. Maybe in Oregon. Oregon. I think Carl goes to Oregon from time to time. And so forth. Yeah. Wherever we go. Let's close by singing together number 113. We'll just sing one verse, just for fun.